This is a Film Stories original podcast.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am joined by Tom Shone, author of many books, including a forthcoming book. Can we talk about that, Tom? Can I say the
Sure, yeah, no, that's on its way next later this year. The Greengrass papers about Paul Greengrass.
Excellent. So I'm really looking forward to that. His past books include Blockbuster and the Nolan variations, which he didn't name the Nolan Twisters, which would have been my personal choice of title. Primarily because nobody remembers the Nolan sisters because they don't live in 1970s TV land the way I do. But we're here to talk about and to some degree lend our voices, I suppose, to what I've been struck by is on David Lynch's passing, the absolute outpouring of affection for this filmmaker, and he feels like almost the most unlikely recipient. If you had told me in the 1980s that David Lynch would be receiving this, or even the 1990s, I would have been skeptical.
It's definitely been noticeable, hasn't it? Like I've been overwhelmed. But even on the first day, all the sort of social media feeds sort of lit up. It was David Lynch after David Lynch after David Lynch. That was surprising, but it sort of carried on, and these sort of tributes and reminiscences and have continued to sort of roll out. And yeah, it's surprising, when you think about the initial shock of certain films of his, like Blue Velvet, and less so when you think about that kind of strain of sort of transcendental beatitude, is for want of a better word, that he leaned into as well. Think about the Robin at the end of Blue Velvet, and then the dream that ends The Elephant Man. I mean, it's strange. Like, his movies are sort of strangely upbeat at the last hurdle. You think they're heading into the heart of darkness, and then there's this stream of transcendentalism that he kind of hits, and that lifts you out. And so. And that's obviously, I think, his own spiritual beliefs and his own practices clearly had such an effect on him and his collaborators, and it kind of radiates out. I kind of think you really got a sense of somebody very special having, gone, just from the kind of quality of the energy that it was being picked up by those around him. I don't know if you. I definitely was like, it was marked anyway, and I think it really just goes down to like the man's character as it was reflected in those movies. But yeah, there is something much more. But I know what you're saying. It's definitely very, it's definitely surprising, in the sense that you wouldn't have known that necessarily.
I would throw in as well that when the Good Witch turns up at the end of Wild at Heart as another sort of transcendental moment.
The ultimate happy ending.
Yeah. And you realise, it's not just sort of referring to Wizard of Oz. It is the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
I think part of it has been that he is a film director who has become much more than a film director. And it's a bit like Werner Herzog. He's kind of a brand. I mean, I don't like using this word, but he's kind of a brand in and of himself. And that and that, or Miyazaki, the memification of some of these personalities, or the YouTubeification of them. I mean, I watched, for some reason, it popped up on YouTube for free, his masterclass, and I watched the first half of that, which I was always curious about these masterclasses that are advertised on my Facebook page, as like what exactly stops them from just being like a face-to-face interview or documentary or head-to-head, or
so the whole idea of like someone going to David Lynch for filmmaking tips is to me just hilarious. Like it's like it's so funny that it's people like Herzog and Lynch. Listen, every Lynch interview is for me a kind of gorgeous exercise in kind of comedy with the interviewer coming along, and they kind of they give him these sort of very literal questions about what the lady in the radiator means, or what do the donuts mean, and then he kind of radar jams them with and sort of shuts down that whole no, he says, and then he'll give them this kind of wonderfully opaque sort of gem to take home. Look at the donut, not the hole, or ideas are like fish. He'll say, or empty rooms are slow. And then, but the idea of going to him for like filmmaking tips when those movies are so about as idiosyncratic as you could possibly get, and the same with her.
It's like going to Samuel Beckett and asking him how to write a play. It's just like he can tell you how to write a Samuel Beckett play, perhaps, but as far as how to write your play or how to write a play, you're at a total loss. Yeah,
absolutely worse than useless, because you would be totally thinking about him and not yourself and what you do for your thing. So but I do think that he became a kind of guru on a wider stage than just, if you like, people wanting to make movies and looking for tips. I think when you sort of look at the way, he mostly communicated about, the thing he really wanted to communicate was the meditation. And whenever he kind of went to social media and did so, there's this kind of, more a spiritual guru that he was listened to. Maybe that's kind of why, he's been putting it out into the universe now for a good many decades. And maybe that was the thing that we just saw come good with all these recollections. And as much as the movies, it was just that energy that he put out sort of came back to him, So it does testify to his character, and he just seems to have been such a remarkably happy camper, reading all the various accounts. Almost sort of bizarrely so, like kind of a really contented person. And it's so rare, I think, to even find that in real life outside of the creative, universe. And certainly within it, it's definitely, I remember, I haven't interviewed him. I interviewed Isabella Rossellini, and she always said, he was the happiest person, one of the happiest people she had ever met, knew. And it always really, that always stayed with me. I was like, how remarkable,
I was watching a clip of him talking yesterday, and as I think a lot of us have been doing, and he was talking about suffering, and he was saying, Vincent van Gogh no doubt suffered, but he didn't suffer when he painted, and he compares it. He sort of uses this wonderfully illuminating analogy where he says, could you imagine having diarrhea and how much harder it is for you to create art when you have diarrhea than it is when you don't have diarrhea? And that was his sort of suffering is not linked to art in any positive sense.
That thing about Van Gogh not suffering when he painted is brilliant, and very sharp and so simple. What an amazing response. I don't know. He certainly doesn't seem to have suffered. The only thing that I can really, you look in vain, read biographies of the man, to sort of find out, where some of the sort of darkness of those films kind of come from, the surrealism of the films, and you just can't find it. Like, you look at his upbringing in Idaho, and it just seems bucolic, and the only thing that was wrong with it is that it ended at a certain point, and they moved states, and he was in tears that they were leaving his home of however many years. That's about it. That the idyll ended is the only sort of jolt to that childhood, that you can make out, and that's not to say that it's not a big one. So yeah, it's kind of he's definitely a remarkable, as everybody said, there's nothing. Sometimes you just see when someone like that goes, it becomes very clarifying. And certainly, like I've kind of grown up with those films.
I was going to ask, what was your sort of first
Entry point?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to say, I mean, something got me along to see Blue Velvet when that came out. I think I must have seen The Elephant Man before that, but I don't think I had connected it with anybody.
Did you not see Dune
No, I didn't.
in the cinemas?
No, so it was Blue Velvet, and I honestly couldn't tell you what had got me along because it certainly wasn't David Lynch at that point. It wouldn't have been Dennis Hopper, who, I wouldn't have known who that was. Isabel Rossellini, I might have known a little bit about just because of her parents. So I really don't know. But anyway, I do remember that the film had such an effect on me that I had in the months previous, I'd been trying to learn how to smoke, and I'd been struggling because smoking is horrible. Yeah. And like to actually convince your lungs to sort of take down that terrible rasping, smoky air is really difficult. And like a lot of addictions, you have to sort of put in the time, and it's really rotten. And so I had really been failing. And then I came out of Blue Velvet and I went to catch the bus home in Brighton. And before I knew it, at the bus stop, I was sort of sucking down my second cigarette, and it just happened like that, And of course, it's ironic because Lynch was a lifelong smoker, and it's likely what killed him in combination with other things. But I definitely had it was the film, and I was after that point about as obsessed with that film as I think I've ever been with any movie. Like a lot of people, it's just everything about it became sort of charged, and the music. I mean, I obviously saw it as many times as I could. The music, everything about it, except I knew very little about how it was made or any of that. But and then when Twin Peaks and Wild at Heart came along, they kind of like gave me a chance to go back into that universe. I mean, it was really intense, that whole period from when Blue Velvet came out right through the early 90s when everybody kind of basically got him and he went global, I was trying to remember that period. It really was.
I mean, he was like on the cover of the NME and stuff like that. It was like he just crossed over. The Pixies did a cover version of Heaven from Eraserhead, and I just remember him being like just ubiquitous and sort of like the idea of, and this was. That period of, it was almost like when the very first Twin Peaks came out, it was almost, oh, wait a minute, it was like seeing your favorite band becomes #1 in the charts. With a catchy tune, it was like Shiny Happy People. You sort of like, okay, I'm glad, but I was here with Murmur, for crying out loud. I was here with Radio Free Europe.
Well, there is the kind of question. I mean, I do remember feeling, I'm still a little bit divided on Wild at Heart. I remember seeing that in the cinema. There was a quality in it, which I think now is Blue Velvet had felt like a film which you felt like the only person watching it. It kind of burrowed into you. And then I remember with Wild at Heart, I sort of felt a little bit more like it was this sort of public offering, and that it was entertaining many other people, and one can, and the humor now was something that everybody definitely was getting. Like I remember with Blue Velvet, like you didn't know whether you were supposed to laugh or not, and that was a kind of key moment of innocence, because I think after Wild at Heart and Twin Peaks, I think people knew that they were supposed to laugh, and that sort of changed something a little bit. Like I think he knew too, because obviously some of them are very funny, and he started playing. But comedy is very conscious, and and he was always such a kind of unconscious artist. I felt like, clearly he was one of the most deeply intuitive, artists there have been. And so the comedy bothered me for that reason, because it didn't seem part of that. It seemed a little bit more conscious. And so I liked him thereafter most when he was terrifying me, and I was sort of forgetting that he was the entertainment a little bit more. So there were moments of Mulholland Drive, for instance, where I definitely felt that again. that kind of nape of the neck shiver that I'd sort of felt when Dennis Hopper first came on screen. And I kind of liked him when he got scary again, I think.
I just watched Lost Highway last night as a preparation for this, as my least watched Lynch. I thought I remember that being one. I don't know. It's like one of those albums that you have between two really popular albums. It's, you have Abbey Road and Sergeant Pepper's and Abbey Road, and you have like your White Album in between, and Lost, and yet like that. It's enduring, that film. It really does a lot, which and what you're talking about, that sense of danger you had with Dennis Hopper coming on the screen. I don't think I've ever encountered a filmmaker who, on watching his films for the very first time, sitting in the cinema, I felt a more palpable sense of danger, that something really could hit me at any moment. And I would include horror movies, and everything.
That's very right. It was lit. Yeah, that's exactly the feeling. When Frank Booth, you mean in particular, like I remember feeling dread. Like I didn't, that feeling of like, I hope he doesn't come back.
Yes, like, yeah, exactly. Yes,
like that very primal.
Not somebody I love to hate, somebody I just fucking hate.
So, like you physically dreading the return of that character to the screen again, and that's what I really remember. And like, I'm not sure that this is entirely pleasant, this whole experience. It's kind of it's going at the limits of like kind of what a movie can do to me, like that feeling. Yeah, like it's sort of. I would
add that. Okay, so my first experience of David Lynch was Dune. I was a 12-year-old Dune fan. I said Dune, it's not because to distinguish it from the month. And I'd read the novel, and I was very precocious, and I went to see the film, and I loved the film. And I remember Channel 4 in the run-up to the film had this extensive retrospective of, well, extensive as in it wasn't that many films. They showed A Razorhead and Elephant Man, and they had an hour-long interview with David Lynch. So I also knew. I wasn't just going, even as a 12-year-old, this is crazy, but even as a 12-year-old, I wasn't going to the film just thinking. I was going to the film as this is a David Lynch film, as well as my favorite science fiction novel. And even watching that, I remember being freaked out by the fact that the villain had this horrible acne and skin problems, and they drank mice that as they're sucking through the straw, the container crushes the mouse and they drink up the liquefied remains. And Sting turns up in famous leather, but it's just so there's such a sense of incest and sex going on in that movie, and like the Beast Raban, played by Paul Smith, is again exactly that character of like, God, I'm terrified of that guy. I don't want that. He's a Frank Booth figure who is yet to be unleashed, because this is Dune, not Blue Velvet. But it's all there. It's all waiting. I mean, and the tragedy of the film, of course, is it doesn't get unleashed. It gets cut back. It gets, they get to about the 1.5 hour mark, and it's an amazing movie for 1.5 hours. And then about that mark, you can actually, it's when Charney's voiceover begins, or the voiceover, Vijaya Madsen, I think it is, sorry. When she begins talking and she says, Paul and Charney fell in love. It's kind of like, skip to the end. You're telling us what happens in 100 pages of the book now to just get to the final part.
I kind of feel like, I mean, the question of sort of how much of a storyteller he was is interesting. I mean, because Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive and a lot of those movies exist in this kind of circling motion. There's something eternal and circling about the plots. They kind of almost seem like kind of loops, don't they? And I think that rather mesmeric. And Twin Peaks ideally would have just carried on forever with us not knowing who killed Laura Palmer. He definitely had a natural tendency, towards sort of open-endedness and not to narrative closure. And the only ones that really kind of do, I think, are straight stories, apart from the straight story, is Blue Velvet and The Elephant Man. But then there's but I think of Blue Velvet as being such a sort of perfectly told story. It's like a kind of it could be a fairy tale, like it's literally there's in terms of the narrative of it. So and then The Elephant Man again. I mean, extraordinarily moving, on a straightforward level of, you could imagine other people directing it other than him. It wouldn't be the same movie, but it's sort of, it's a bit like kind of, you look at I guess it's a little bit like Picasso in the sense that, yes, of course, there was an extraordinary draftsman in there, before he became abstract. And with Lynch too, he clearly had the ability to tell stories, but he increasingly didn't want to. But yeah, certainly in June, the gears are crunching like crazy between the Hollywood machine is kind of chewing up against him.
And yet, Dino De Laurentiis is the producer of Blue Velvet.
Yeah.
He kind of says of generosity, of like,
Yeah.
okay, you gave me a huge failure, but I feel I owe you one.
It's amazing. I mean, De Laurentiis, the debt that we owe him for the farsightedness of kind of then going one extra for this guy and giving him saying of him to Blue Velvet, I'll do this. I think for half, he'd proposed a larger budget. He said, I'll do this for half the budget. And then just absolutely defending it through, some terrible test screenings and audience reaction, just saying, well, I like it. So, we're carrying it. I mean, an amazing, De Laurentiis is that's his high point in a way, but it's what a film to have sort of shepherded into the world. Certainly I remember the feeling. It's actually the same feeling I had with Badlands. We were talking about Badlands. I think both Badlands and Blue Velvet belong to me in the same category of film. They're the most narrative driven of really quite dreamy filmmakers, and they're also perfect. And you come out of both films kind of going, where did that film come from? Like that film just seems to have dropped from the sky. It's so perfect. Like what, like I remember with Blue Velvet, I just like, how does that get made in the sense of like the traditional thing of like, how did someone give the money for Taxi Driver? I don't mean like that. I literally mean almost any aspect of it. How does he direct actors? How does he shoot them? How does he get that? To this day, I don't think I've ever read a really good account of like how Lynch, makes his ensemble, shapes his ensemble to deliver a Lynch film. And it's, and there's something, I've read that somebody says, well, he likes to take things really slow, and he'd say, just take it slower, take it slower, I've heard actors who said, well, he just let me go completely to the 11 on this, so you think, well, that kind of does, I understand that, but it still doesn't tell me like how he gets that quality,
I mean, there's that wonderful gif of him saying, okay, let's try one more time, but this time good.
No.
I mean, Cal McLachlan did a wonderful essay for the New York Times, and he talked about how he would just stand beside him. They would just stand beside each other, and he'd somehow get it. And
Really?
there was almost an osmosis. Or he'd say something like a little bit more Elvis, or could you put a bit of wind in there? And and there'd be and funnily enough, I was listening to Angelo Badalamenti as well talking about his process, and he said he sat in a room with him with a keyboard composing Twin Peaks, and basically David would say, we're in a forest, it's the middle of the night, there are owls, and the owls have the secrets, and we need to find out what the secrets of the owls are. And Angelo would be right, he would be, well, how about these chords here? He'd be like, yes, that's it, there's a traffic light hanging in the middle of a town, but no cars. And it's basically, I'll give you the tone poems. It's like when you're writing, you put on some music to write to, and no, not that music isn't working for me, so I'm gonna. And he's providing the music for other artists to work to. And
that's funny.
One thing I'd add as well is from the point of view of a cinema artist, a cinematic, somebody who's obviously in charge of sort of editing as well to some degree, and he strikes me as the real director he has a lot in common with is Buñuel, in the sense that he has these very basic things that everybody could do, but nobody does, which is he rewind the camera, let's use reverse. Let's just reverse an image. So there's an image in Lost Highway where a burning hut goes backwards, or let's speed something up, or let's slow it down. And he uses that sort of elemental sort of grammar of filmmaking to such huge effect. You know, the way Cocteau would, and that, you know, Wild at Heart, let's just have a striker match and film the fire up close, or let's just have Dennis Hopper say, "Now it's dark," and really embody. So it's, you know, he has these elements that he goes back to again and again and again, but they are crucial. They're fun. You know, fizzing electricity was one of his fascinations, and you don't have to go far to get that in a Lynch film.
You reminded me of one of my favorites, which is in Blue Velvet, when Dennis Hopper says, "Let's hit the effing road," and then literally he disappears.
Yeah.
And it's just the simplest of editing tricks, the oldest one in the book, right?
Absolutely.
The hearse is there, it's not there anymore. And suddenly, and it lends him this feeling of like something supernatural, like this phantom, you know, like kind of he can appear and disappear like that. But a very simple, it's just this trick, there's just the tricks of cinema used by somebody intensely curious, naive in some. He's a kind of great artist of naivety. You kind of feel that his kind of great gift somehow was to retain this kind of quality of naivete that, you know, gets drummed out of us, you know, that children have. But hear him talk, and it's sort of, sometimes you're like, is there a point there, or is that fantastically like when he starts giving the advice, you know, about the eye of the duck being the key to the making of the film, and you're like, hey, is there something there, or is this like Chauncey Gardner, you know, being there where he says the seasons will change? But that quality of naivety was sort of very key, and I think kind of he approached film that with. He came to it, didn't he, from painting? So he was a painter first, and then the story goes that he saw a painting of his move, or imagined it moving as a forest at night, and he imagined a wind, and he heard the wind, and he thought, well, that's interesting if that were to move, and then that became the springboard into the movies. And it's sort of like, I don't think I've ever heard such a. It's very. I mean, he certainly didn't. He wasn't one of those directors that sort of came to the medium from the crib, you know, like some do, and they watch and they kind of go, "That's for me." So I think that too kind of strengthened and fortified his sort of vision of things when he came to the movies. But yeah, it's sort of. But the thing about the way he directed his collaborators is absolutely wonderful, because you sort of feel like the notes he gave people was, that's how to give a note. You know, that's how to suggest to an actor something, is to say, I need a bit more wind or whatever. I mean, there's such a kind of respect for their creative process, you know, rather than pulling them into some kind of conscious analysis of like what they've just done and can they do something differently. It's sort of like you really are giving when he says something like that, he's firing their imagination, you know, and that's what unites everybody on that film set, whether they be the editor or the actor it's kind of like they're all there because they like imagining things. And he is the director because he ultimately, I think that I've been thinking since he passed about the quality of imagination that he had and must have had when he was you know, a young boy, and just what a remarkable imagination he and I mean that almost as like a kind of muscle. I mean, he had one of those kind of, you know, here's where the upbringing was important, was that he was given the security and love by his parents, and then the freedom to roam. I think that's the interesting thing here. They said, go off and do your thing. And he had immense freedom over his 2 blocks of whatever it was to just roam that neighborhood. So there was this freedom to kind of explore. And you definitely get that with the films, and certainly with the making of them, when you hear everybody talk, that kind of curious, exploratory, highly imaginative. It's really kind of rather, you know, it's really kind of remarkable. Maybe one of the last imaginations that sort of wasn't touched by. I mean, he didn't seem to. Am I right in saying that he didn't watch that much TV? I want to say. I mean, that's unusual. Certainly, he wasn't plugged into movies, and absolutely, certainly not. You know, there's no internet to distract him. You know, just a kind of an extraordinary post-war bit of kind of imagination cultivation. You know, in the sort of suburbs of Idaho. It's like so yeah. It is kind of, when I look back on him now, I definitely think that's really what we're remarking on the loss of, as much as the films, but that kind of that his imagination as it lived through him is it will really kind of, that's the thing that kind of, I think, kind of is timeless and is, yeah, it sort of links him with all the kind of greats.
I read his, well, I didn't read, I listened to the audiobook of his autobiography, Room to Dream, which is a brilliant book because it's sort of alternate chapters between him and a writer. I think I can't remember the name of the.
Steve McKenna.
There you go. And she writes what you'd want from a biography. You know, he went to this school and all that. And then you get his memories as told by him. And I think there's a bit where he says that his mum didn't buy him coloring books because she didn't want him to need to have lines to have to color in between. She wanted him to make his own stuff. So,
right.
You know, that comes back again to this idea of, and the only time, because he's this very sweet, beautiful voiced man talking about how beautiful it was to grow up in nature and how his dad worked in the forestry commission and all this sort of stuff. And the only time, the first time he does, this repeats itself a little bit during the book, but the only time he gets really excised is when he's describing school. And he goes from being sort of like this really placid, you know, we were having a lot of fun and I met a lot of my friends there. And then I went to school and there's this pause and he just goes, I fucking hated it. It was so fucking boring. And there's just this sense of, you could hear that he's still furious that he had to waste his time, that he hasn't helped him in any way whatsoever, and he's just still seething about the waste of his childhood on school. And then you see what he did when he went to college, and then later when he went to to AFI. He was a second year of AFI, and he basically used AFI as his own studio in order, you know, he used the stables famously in the Greystone Mansions to shoot Eraserhead, and it took like it took years. I mean, it's 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer, to shoot the film. And he, famously, when it came out, he wrote a letter to his mum saying, I've just made a film called Eraserhead, which will be out in cities around America. Please do not go and see it. Please do not tell anybody else to go and see it.
That's good. That's funny. That's, you know, the school thing is kind of funny, isn't it? Like, I can see that. I can see that. He wasn't, because it's time away from the things he would rather be doing, right? Yeah. He's had a clear sense of what he wanted to be doing. And
what's your take on Eraserhead? Because that's a film we haven't touched on yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen that for a while, so I'd be interested to see. I mean, I do remember I had an initial pass at it where I was too young for it, so I was kind of like, it freaked me in a way that I wasn't interested in pursuing. That's why I think that I had seen The Elephant Man and but not Eraserhead. So I'll be interested to kind of go back to it. I certainly think now, having kind of gone with the later films, it will be a film to kind of go back to. But yeah, it's the remarkable thing about it is that that it kind of impressed Mel Brooks so much. Like I think that's kind of the because he was so certain, wasn't he, that they said, well, Mel Brooks was up to maybe produce The Elephant Man, and they said, you really should go and see Mel, this other film that he's done, Eraserhead. And at that point, I think Lynch just kind of goes, okay, well, nice seeing you guys. This clearly isn't going to work out. Once he's seen that, I'm done. And but instead he kind of bounds out and sort of, you're a madman, I love you, but it's Mel Brooks that's the madman to have looked at Eraserhead and seen that he could do The Elephant Man from that. I don't get that. That is an incautious response. So I don't know. It's but yeah, it's the factories. I do remember the imagery and the fact. The link is the factory imagery, isn't it? With Eraserhead set in that sort of industrial setting, which is. And then, the Elephant Man being the kind of Victorian example of that, and which, by all accounts, is kind of Lynch's version of Philadelphia from his time there. It's sort of, it's interesting in that like he's the least autobiographical of artists, and he's the least likely subject for any kind of biographical treatment. But on the other hand, everything that appears in those films seems to point back to like his upbringing and, up to the point where he became an adult. I think he has, you think about Twin Peaks and then, yeah, I mean, all the films, all of them are in a sense harking back to his experience on Earth in the first couple of decades of it. That's it. And like kind of, but then it's the hole in the donut question, because then you go looking for like the first cause, and you don't find it. You don't find the trauma. You don't find the thing that did it. But you do find that whole all the kind of the landmarks just endlessly memorialized, and that sort of I would imagine that loss of innocence. I think that like that's the thing I remember thinking. What if you come out of, sorry to keep going back to Blue Velvet, but it had such an effect on me.
That's okay.
That is clearly the film of somebody who has experienced for whom the loss of innocence is a seismic event in their life. That's all you can really say about it, because the trick of the movie, which is the trick of all of the subsequent work, which is to kind of lend the voice of innocence and the characters that represent innocence, this kind of like balmy, slightly bland, they speak like kind of Hallmark cards, and they kind of give you this very
like the police inspector saying, "Yes, that's an ear."
Yeah, this kind of exactly. They're given this very. But yeah, I'm thinking too of the speeches that Laura Dern gets in that film.
Oh yeah,
yes. The birds going to heaven, and like this kind of like extremely kitsch. That's the representation of goodness in that film, and it's sort of something from either a Jeff Koons or a Hallmark, or Jeff Koons' version of a Hallmark card. And then you get Dennis Hopper, who is drawn with such extraordinarily porous detail. Like the psychological kinks of that man are seen in such a horrifying close-up. It's a mixture of approaches. You've got Hallmark card versus absolutely porous, realistic psychological detail on this one guy, and that contrast, voice innocence as expressed through these very bland kind of, and then the voice of kind of horrific sort of experience as given full, bloody, realistic portrayal. That is the central thing that kind of convulses each movie after that. And you're like, that is the work of somebody who feels and will always feel that loss of innocence as being such the biggest shock of their life. The simplicities of innocence of childhood gave way to adult complexities and darkness, and and so that's kind of why I feel that if you can get rid of the pejorative overtones of the word adolescent, I believe that David Lynch is this poet of adolescence. I think he's got this kind of adolescent worldview, that's when he hinge the most. That's when there are the sort of biggest revolutions going on, and that's where he is set up shop to make his movies from. And so it's sort of, I don't mean anything rude by that at all. I'm just sort of saying that's where he kind of comes from. And
it's like it's like the poetry of puberty, isn't it? It's like that real sense of extremes, that you never have as much lust as you do in those days, and yet your lust is something new and shocking to yourself. I mean, it's the thing that it all comes from this act of forbidden sexuality. He wants to spy on a woman for, undressing.
yeah,
He wants to violate her space and her privacy in order to satisfy himself, and that's projected onto these well, what if I let that lust go? Where would it take me? And it would take me to someone like Frank, who is, I will, and then there's a, layer upon layer. The additional thing is, what if women want or in some way I can't even begin to fathom, to be
Right.
victimized by men in this, and that's what makes it such an intensely uncomfortable movie.
Yeah.
And it will never age, because you will
Yeah.
always, people say, oh, this will be out of date now because we're all so much used to stuff. Well, what
You
about
see,
what about that scene where Valerie turns up after the date he's had with Laura Dern, and he turns up, and Valerie comes out of the shrubbery of Laura Dern's house, naked with
yeah.
bruises all over her body, having been obviously badly
Yeah.
and says to everyone, he put his disease in me, which has got
Yeah.
to be the most uncomfortable and at the same time funny scenes I've ever seen. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
how is that comic? And yet, it's like, what's the worst thing anyone can have on the end of their first date? You know?
I was thinking about that in Blue Velvet, and I was thinking about that in Wild at Heart. There's a scene in Wild at Heart at the end that is a little. So when I watched it again the other night, and I remember it made me feel uncomfortable in the wrong way. In Blue Velvet, it's uncomfortable in the wrong. That she has been victimized and has kind of masochistically kind of become captive to and sexualized in turn the treatment that she gets from Dennis Hopper. That strikes me as deeply uncomfortable, but it bears correspondence to something real in the world that happens, and it's just very uncomfortable to watch. There's a similar scene at the end of Wild at Heart where Lula is kind of turned on by Bobby Peru, the Willem Dafoe character, who she loathes, but who nonetheless seduces her with dirty talk, coming closer and closer to her until finally she kind of like, she says something that reveals that she's turned on by him, at which point he snaps away from her and walks out the door and says, well, it had to be another time, love. And there's something very, and then she breaks down in tears because she's betrayed Sailor, and it's like that. I can imagine that was a little, watching that made me more uncomfortable, I must say. And it made me think more about kind of Lynch and his sort of sexual hang-ups than I wanted to. Uh, Blue of course does, but like you don't want that sense of a sort of male auteur, if you like, just having things his way. And you could see that if there's going to be a sort of feminist critique of kind of Lynch, I think you'd want to start with Wild at Heart, not Blue Velvet, but
Oh,
that's
I mean, Lost Highway has intensely uncomfortable scenes as well of Patricia Arquette
yeah.
having to undress with a gun to her head while she's being watched by Robert Lodger. This is something of the interesting aspect of watching the trajectory of Lynch's career contemporaneously is compared to how he is being perceived right now, is I remember several real dips in his reputation. Obviously the Dune, when Blue Velvet came out, it was very much he's still here, he's been allowed to make another film. And when Lost Highway came out, I think there was a real sense of like, oh, it's the same old shtick. And there was from a political point of view, David Lynch was seen as a very conservative. He was playing with surrealism, and from a very conservative point of view, feminists were deeply offended by. Not that I want to portray feminists as one big block. Actually, there were feminists who really took to his films, others who he was flat out accused of misogyny throughout his career as well.
Yeah.
So for him to become this sort of cuddly grandpa of Zen is it is a turn up, to say the least. I mean, I would say about that, it's interesting that Wilder Heart, because again, that scene is incredibly uncomfortable, and that to me is what sort of rescues it, if you like. And it is about our physical, the separation between what we might want mentally or from our souls and what we might be manipulated into wanting physically. And there's an interesting scene in a film that was just out this year called The Assessment, where a similar sort of thing happens, but it's a man who is being kind of manipulated to the point where his qualms go away, and lead him to a betrayal. And it's one of those things as well that we're much more willing to see it from a male point of view as being kind of acceptable and understandable than we are from a female point of view. It's like the man, well, of course, he got horny, so of course he would, he would. Whereas from a female point of view, we still have this patronizing romantic notion of she can't be that horny to have betrayed the innermost love of her life,
No, I mean, it's definitely you're definitely aware that he's a sort of male director. I mean, there's sort of question, he seems to have had this kind of, again, there's a sort of great naivety, I think, when it comes to, women in his life, in the sense that, I mean, he got married 4 times, I think I'm right in saying, and he sort of, there's an account of being kissed by Elizabeth Taylor in that McKenna book, which is sort of such a remarkable, it's a sort of remarkable story. I can't really sort of tell it for you. You should, definitely look it up. And it's sort of, but he does seem to have been. There's an element of naivety when it comes to women, and that's in the movies, obviously. And it's part of that kind of adolescent sort of mindset. At the same time, there's such kind of like honesty in exposing his own drives. And as you say, that kind of scene on the lawn, with Dorothy, and, is excruciating. I mean, a lot of Blue Velvet is excruciating because you sort of, as you say, I think he's projecting his own feelings about his own sexuality and its bestiality, into these characters. I just remember, like that, an initial speech of Hopper's that he gets, or not speech, but the dialogue that he's sort of grunting when he first arrives about his mummy, and it's so intimate. I mean, it just makes you blush to sort of hear a man on screen utter such things. Like it's sort of like, I think. Yeah, and yet, maybe that accounts for why he was giggling when he shot the scene. I think that was the thing that kind of shocked Isabella Rossellini when she shot that rape scene, is that like he was giggling throughout the whole thing, and there was sort of like, I can only think like there's that sense of taboo. So one can only say that there's sort of immense bravery too in the kind of portrayal of these things and the kind of self-exposure that it brings. I mean,
I love the thing when he was casting Dennis Hopper, and Dennis Hopper phoned him up and said, "I want to do this because I am Frank Booth," and David Lynch said to him, "Well, that's very good news and very bad news."
I mean, it's kind of like because I don't think that Lynch's exposure to such people, as Frank Booth, can have been very great at all, if any. I mean, I think like, he really is the Carl McLaughlin figure, and this sort of straight kid to some degree. And I don't think, and yet there's such kind of, he has such grasp of things. The thing that always kind of like, I always thought was really interesting about him is that, like, you see a lot of scenes in movies that are supposed to represent depravity or the ultimate, the ultimate in depravity.
Yes, and it's always 2 women kissing, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's always, and also the other thing that I would say is that, like, when people do these scenes, whether it be Eyes Wide Shut or whatever the movie, there's always too much movement. And like the thing that I remember about Lynch's scenes, whenever you finally get through to the kind of the red room, you get through to the thing where things are most fucked up and gnarly, and there's this kind of wonderful stillness to everything, like Pussy Heaven in Blue Velvet. Everybody's just standing around, and if it's like a kind of like all the drug dens in the world are just they're just static. There's people just smoking opium and they just lay it out. They're just zoned out. And there's this kind of opiate sort of like stillness to like those scenes that I kind of totally believe. And I kind of want to know, it's like, where has he got the knowledge to know that that's kind of how, that's what depravity looks like? It's not some big writhing orgiastic kind of thing on screen.
Dance
it's people
scene,
checked out and wobbling vaguely to a bit of music, and you know what I mean? Like that is what you see. was a revelation. That's sort of amazing insight, and and it's sort of cinematic, and it's unexpected, and but I remember taking that away and just thinking, I remember those scenes, yeah, with Stockwell, and just sort of thinking, that's what it all looks like when you get to the end of the evening.
Yeah, because it's when all the bars are closed. Well, listen, Tom, we're gonna have to leave it there, but we haven't even mentioned Mulholland Drive to any great extent, and Inland Empire.
We must have another.
Of course, his last film, Duran Duran, Upstaged.
That will have to be for another day.
The fact that he finished on Duran Duran Upstaged as his final cinematic feature is kind of funny. That typically surreal twist. Simon Le Bon describing dreams between Hungry Like the Wolf, done not quite as you remember it.
There you go. That's the Lynchian twist for us.
Just for a final question then, of that latter period Lynch, and of course Twin Peaks: The Return we haven't talked about, which my daughters got into David Lynch from that, and then worked backwards, and they absolutely loved that. And they were like young. They were really young when they watched that. They were like 14 and 12, and they got into it so much. Terrible father letting them watch such depravity, but So what of that? Those? Of which of those latter ones?
Mulholland Drive for certain, and
terrifying.
I wasn't, and I would say that's it. It's a sort of long slope down, I think, from that. And in terms of the quality, I think, but I think his energies were going elsewhere at that point, and I'm never sure that I liked the quality of video work as it's used. On screen anyway. Inland Empire, remind me, was that shot on video?
Yeah, that's shot on, not only on video, but really cheap video. It's like he just got it.
I must say that didn't kind of work for me. I maybe did for some people. I don't want to yuck someone's yum, but there's something about celluloid that I kind of feel like it. It made me feel awake. It woke me out of the dream, I must admit. I think that's partly it. The video just made me feel like I was alert and in the day. And, where celluloid for me feels like the medium for kind of night and dream. And, it's luscious and you kind of go into it and all those colors. That to me, I felt like too with Twin Peaks: The Return had the same quality. There's a lot of gray in a lot of those things. And I was... I mean the color gray, and it's sort of, I didn't like that. I think of Lynch and I just think of those red drapes and all the Prussian blues and the kind of there's such gorgeous color there, and it's used so brilliantly. The roses and tulips and and then the blue, the sky. He uses color so well that I didn't like the draining of the palette that kind of went on in those sort of later films and in Twin Peaks: The Return. And but I think that Mulholland Drive is the real, the last kind of big, kind of great movie that he did. And there's things in that, I think, that are absolutely fantastic. And
the Straight Story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but isn't that a bit before? I can't remember. Isn't that was that in the 90s? I seem to remember. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I was maybe thinking it came afterwards, but that
maybe well, either way, also great. And but I think that in itself, I think that to some degree he was right not to make so many. I mean, people always say, I wish he'd made more. And I kind of feel like if he had, he might have kind of got curdled by it. I mean, there's something about the movies, and particularly as the movies meet an audience, that can be a little corrupting. And he definitely was not, he was never part of Hollywood, and he was never going to put together a quote unquote career in the same way that other directors do. And I kind of like the slightly intermittent quality of his work. And I think it testifies to somebody who really had other things going on and genuinely did. I think kind of overexposure certainly to a mass audience was never going to be the thing for him. And I think, and that he lost it after Twin Peaks or with films like Lost Highway is probably the best thing for him. And certainly the idea of trying to keep that kind of global roller coaster thing running is an anathema to like a talent like his. And the sooner he got off that treadmill, the better. So yeah, he needed to that balloon needed to pop, and then so yeah, I think he's made the films that he was meant to make, and the ones, as you say, that he has left us with are kind of getting larger and in our estimation, and
I
I'm
love
sure.
I love that fact, and I love the fact that I finished watching Highway last night, and looked in the bonuses, and there was some short films, so I put some on, and there was one of them was called The Lamp, and it was just him making a lamp that was used in the film, like from scratch in his workshop. And he was talking to the camera, and he was going, we need a little bit of ochre here, and we need this, and this I get, and this, you put this on the gauze, and it's really, and then I file it down, and then time for a coffee break. And he'd go, and you were just thinking, my God, I just realized that when he's making a movie, like shooting a movie, he's taking time out of that workshop, and he's so happy in that workshop that why would you want him not to be in that workshop? Okay, he's using the lamp as an excuse to make this little video, so it's a little extension of the film as well.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, this guy's not sitting at home miserable because he's not making a movie. He's not like a Steven Spielberg, who perhaps doesn't exist if he's not making movies.
Yeah.
He's got this huge Zen, the doing of the thing is the thing.
And the woodworking, I think, is particularly important to him. I think that's sort of, and the sort of the making of these objects. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, there's immense kind of craft, isn't there, in those films? I mean, he's doing a lot of the earlier ones. He's sort of doing those effects for himself. He's building sets for himself. I think he tried to make the Elephant Man, make up himself. Didn't work out, but like, it's sort of, but yeah, he was trying to do it all, and so no, there's definitely like, he's got that kind of whittling. He's a whittler, and he's worked with wood. It's like there's an immense patience, isn't there?
Yeah.
And it's very mesmerizing. It's sort of, that again goes back to the word I kind of most. I just am so mesmerized by his films. He was a mesmerizing character, and but woodwork too. You can see him getting lost in that. And again, the conscious mind, switch it off.
Yes.
But he didn't need to become a cobbler like Daniel Day-Lewis. He sort of already had that going. He was already making things.
Well, listen, Tom, thanks so much for talking to me, and I look forward to talking to you again when your book comes out.
Absolutely. All right. Lovely talking to you, John.